So it's now I now welcome Professor Pinaki Chaudhary, um, who all of you know from the physics group, to give the next talk. He will be talking about exploring the world of amorphous solids. Pinaki, looking forward to your talk.
Thanks, Arijit, and organizers. Okay, yeah, so I'll be talking about some recent work that we've been doing in exploring glasses. So glasses are materials that you see in life around you. So, for example, on the on the left hand top panel, you see window glass, and which is a shattered glass, and on the left bottom panel, you see the shaping of a glassware, molten glassware, and there you can see that this is material is viscous enough such that you can shape it to the structure that you want or the shape that you want. So the viscosity of the material is very important in giving it the shape that you need it. So, so these kind of glassy systems are in diverse forms in around our daily lives, and essentially what you'd like to know is how these kind of structures are formed, and what are the properties, and how can we use it in different contexts. And in the physics scenario, it's basically the statistical mechanics of disordered solids, which I'll try to discuss now. So, if we go back to high school, so essentially we know about the three states of matter: gas, liquid, and solid. So if you decrease the temperature of a gas, liquid is formed, and then you have a liquid in coexistence with gas, and there is a meniscus that forms. And as you decrease the temperature even further, so then a solid is formed, and typically in schools that we know, we talk about crystals. So crystals are solids which have at the microscopic level ordered structures. So order is in that form, periodic structure is what characterizes a crystal. On the other hand, we know that in our daily life that there are various kind of glasses, and if you look closely into this kind of glassy systems, these have a structure which is disordered. So this is very different from a crystal, where this kind of ordered structure exists at the very local scale. So crystals correspond to ordered structure, and glasses correspond to disordered structures. Both are solids. So if you look at very closely at the structures, so on the left hand side is the so if you, I mean, for example, if you do some scattering experiment that you throw X-rays or laser into the structure, and then you look at the reflection or the diffraction of it, then you can see that for the crystal you can get this kind of very nice periodic patterns, which are giving you some information about the order that exists within the crystal. This is in the left hand side of this panel. On the right hand side, it's a metallic glass. So there, if you do the same kind of experiments in the right hand corner, you can see that this pattern that you get from this diffraction doesn't have any structure at all. There is no organization that you can see. So this is the contrast. So basically you have in one case a solid which is crystalline, which has an ordered structure, and on the other hand you have a glass which has a disordered structure. So in the case of crystals, it can be shown that because of this ordered structure, you have the rigidity that we are accustomed to. So in general, we know that if I try to break a solid, I have to apply some force, and that is the measure of the rigidity inside the system. So then in the context of the glasses, there is this disordered structure. So then where is the source of this rigidity? So is there some underlying phase transition that is happening that we are not aware of? And this is the million-dollar question that people have been trying to understand for, let's say, 1 century or so. So these are various examples of glasses in our daily lives. So you have standard glasses that we see in a daily, for example, window panes in churches, various kind of glassware. Then you have rocks, volcanic rocks, which are also glasses. And then you have polymeric glasses, which are made of polymers. And so all these glasses have different toughness. So wood is in one corner of this toughness, and then on the other hand, metals are more tough and rigid and so on. But the problem that many of these materials have are they are very brittle. That is, they break very easily. So one of the tasks that material scientists have at hand is to have both a combination of this toughness and also less fracture prone. So how do I tune the properties of this material so that I have a tough material, but it is less fracture prone? And this is something that material scientists would like to answer. And this is a question that everybody is pursuing at the moment. So the characteristic property of all these glass forming systems is that if I decrease the temperature, so at high temperatures, as I told you earlier, so I have a gas, a liquid, and then I decrease the temperature and then I form a solid. So at high temperatures, I have a liquid, and then as I decrease the temperature, the viscosity of the system starts increasing. So you have various kind of glass forming systems over here. Some starts from silicates, which form the window glass, to other kind of with organic liquids and so on. And you can see that for a large category of these materials, you have a very rapid increase in viscosity as the temperature is increased, or the temperature is decreased, or the inverse temperature increases. So, so this kind of rapid increase in viscosity is the characteristic property of various glass forming mixtures. Materials, and one would like to understand how this rapid increase in viscosity is happening in these materials as you decrease the temperature. And this is something that people are trying to understand for, let's say, last century or so, 1 century or so. So I talked earlier, I told you all about hard glasses, so glasses that have lot of, we experience them as very hard materials. On the other hand, you also have what are called soft glasses. So these are gels, emulsions, foams, granular matter. And these are also used in different products that we see, for example, ketchup, ice cream, chocolate, snow, etc., etc. And there have been attempts to put together these diverse kind of materials in sort of a unified scenario, and which is, so either you can form glasses by lowering the temperature, or by increasing the load on a system, or by increasing the density of the system. And then the people have been trying to ask the question whether there are universal properties of these different kinds of glassy systems that you form as you come across these different paths, either by lowering the temperature, or by increasing the density, or by decreasing the load, and so on. So this has been the sort of activity for the last 2 decades or so, and there has been quite a lot of success in trying to find universalities across these different paths and so on. So most of the work that is done in the physics of glasses are difficult to do analytically, because these are many body problems, and you have a lot of interacting objects, and which you need to keep track of. So it's very, except for very simple model systems, these are very difficult to calculate anything analytically. So you have to use computers to look at the systems, to study the systems. Basically, what you have to do is to generate either the trajectory of the entire system as it evolves in time, or you generate different configurations of these glassy systems, which I'll discuss as we move on. So, so basically, then we need computer simulations. And even in computer simulations, what we can do is we can still only work with very simple systems, because we would like to understand first the basic physics that goes into the formation of this kind of glass forming matter. And then one of the standard questions in condensed matter is that if you know the interactions at the very small scale, or the local scale, can you predict what would be the emergent macroscopic behavior? So this is a standard question in condensed matter, and this is also very relevant to the glass forming systems. So using numerical simulations, what also one can do is test different theoretical ideas. So there are different hypotheses that you can make, and then you can test this hypothesis during numerical experiments via simulations. The other thing that you can do is something go beyond the theoretical hypothesis, that you can construct thought experiments like this classical Gedankens in relativity. So there you can think about, you can construct some thought experiment which is not possible to do in labs, but you know that this kind of thought experiments would be useful to probe certain properties of the system. And this is again something which computer simulations are very useful. And then, of course, the other thing that you can do is also explore new phenomena, which perhaps it's not yet known to people. And I mean, again, through this kind of thought experiments, you can start exploring new phenomena. And of course, in the context of material science, if you can figure out the different ways this microscopic constituents lead to some emergent macro behavior, then you can also tune properties at the microscopic scale to design new materials and so on. So these are a lot of tasks at hand, and of course, a huge community is involved in understanding the properties and designing new materials and so on. So I'll just go through the steps of how one can construct a glassy system, and then at the end, I'll try to show you some properties of these glassy systems as you probe via different methods. So in order to construct a glassy system, you need to destroy order. So in order to destroy order, what you need to do is you have to generate local frustrations such that any local ordered motif can be broken apart. And one way to do that is to use a mixture of different sizes. So for example, if you have a one component system where you have a collection of disks, let's say hard disks, and at very high density, this has some kind of order, which is you have these hexagonal motifs that are forming inside the system, and you have a repetition of these hexagonal motifs across the space. Now, if you now start having mixtures of these particles of two different sizes, these hexagonal motifs start breaking apart as you go on increasing the size ratio. So if you go in the lower panel from left to right, so we increase the size ratio of this mixture. So you have large particles and small particles, and beyond this certain threshold size ratio, you no longer see these hexagonal motifs, that is, the order has been broken, but still you can have rigidity inside the system. So similar thing one can do, instead of using a size ratio, you can also use complex environments. So basically some kind of local environment which doesn't allow you to form this kind of local ordered motifs. So for example, what you can do is so imagine that you have a carom board, and you had basically you are having this discs on the carom board, and you had nice packing of these discs. What you could do is now introduce roughness into this carom board, which is at the scale of the discs, the size of the discs. And if you can generate roughness of that order, then you can ask what happens to the packing on that carom board. So similar kind of fields of spatial roughness one can design in experiments using light fields. And what you can see that indeed one can generate rough patterns, and then you can throw your spheres or particles into this rough field and ask what kind of structures will emerge. So this is something that we have tried to do, and so here is some pictorial thing. So basically, if you go from left to right, if you look closely, then if with increasing roughness of this underlying potential, one can have again this local order, which is this local hexagonal order, starts getting broken apart. So if you compare the image on the left and the image on the right, then you can see that these hexagonal motifs are now breaking apart as you go to increasing and increasing roughness of the underlying potential. So then so what we have also recently studied is so it's now you had an ordered structure to begin with, and then if you introduce this external field which is rough, then at the end you have a disordered structure. So then you can ask this question that how this ordered structure melts into this disordered structure. So if in the absence of any external field, at any finite temperature, what happens is you have always some thermal fluctuations that are happening, and what you have is certain defects that are forming inside the system. Okay. Now, if I apply this external field and which is rough, and I increase the roughness of the potential as a function of time, then I can observe how this melting process is happening. So this is so we are slowly ramping up the roughness of the external field. And these green patches that you see are patches where you have the hexagonal order or the hexagonal motifs are not present that much. And you see that these domains of these green patches, which are basically non or disordered regions, these are proliferating in space, and eventually you will get a system which has large domains of disorder. So if I can play the field, play the movies faster, then you can see that these green patches are increasing in size. And eventually you will have a mixture of these green patches and red patches. So red patches are where these hexagonal motifs are there, and the green patches are there, or where these hexagonal motifs are no longer there. So in this way, I mean, one can be more quantitative, and this is what we have done. And you can then observe how this order goes into a disordered structure as a function of time as you increase this, as you increase the roughness of the external potential.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So is there like some amount of minimal space that the green patch should occupy in order for the entire thing to, behave as a glass? Or?
I'll come to that. So, so it's what is being minimized. I'll come to.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So essentially, that's the next slide. So, so these are not something empirical that I showed you, but there is some underlying mathematical reason for that. So what we have here is, in principle, we have n objects inside the in the system, and you have the coordinates r1, r2 to rn, and you can write an energy function which has is a sum over the interaction of these different objects. So essentially, this energy function is a 3n dimension, is a quantity, it's a 3n dimensional space if you are talking about 3D space, or dn dimensional if you are talking about d dimensions and so on. So whatever structures that we observe are at rest are mostly structures which are at the local minimum or minima of this energy function. And in glass forming systems, what one observes is that this energy function, or one could have a free energy function, which is the function which is written down at the bottom. So these kind of functions in this high dimensional space, which is the 3n dimensional space, you have a structure which is very rough. So if you look at the schematic diagram on the left hand top, you have this kind of a rough landscape where you could have a crystalline minimum, or you can also have an ideal glass minimum, which may or may not be realizable. But locally, you have multiple minima which scale with the system size. So the larger the system, the more the such local minimum. And essentially, what you are trying, the system is trying to do as it evolves, it tries to always minimize the energy. And as it tries to minimize the energy, it falls into one of such local minimum. And sometimes thermal fluctuations may try to kick out that system from this local minimum, and then it will hop to the nearest minimum and so on. And because the landscape is so rough, you have a very slow dynamics that the system is evolving through. And this one tries to show that this is essentially the reason why this kind of slowing down of the dynamics is happening as we approach the glassy state and so on. So as the question that was asked just now, so as I'm introducing this external field, slowly this roughness in the landscape is emerging as I introduce this external field, and this increasing roughness of this high dimensional space results in the system getting locked down into one such local minimum. So this energy minimization process is happening as the dynamics is proceeding. Okay, so this is how you get into get these large domains of green and small domains of red and so on. So so this kind of so essentially this is an optimization problem also in a high dimensional space. So it's a very difficult numerical problem, and one can do it only for very small systems. And also there is a dynamical problem of how do you access this minima from one minima to another minima, how do you go across saddles, and how many saddles are there and so on. And this is a very complex problem, and people are trying to solve it even today. I mean, it's a very massive task at hand. Okay, so so in glasses, so this is essentially if I'm trying to reach equilibrium states, what I'm trying to do is essentially reach this local minima in this high dimensional landscape. And in this process, what happens is there's this idea called aging, that properties of the glass depend upon the time it has lapsed since you have done a thermal quench, or you have cooled the system, or some preparation history. So there's this classic experiment that is going on somewhere in New Zealand, where there is tar that is flowing out of a funnel, and they try to count the time between two such drops of the tar. Okay, and if you look at the list, so the first experiment started in 1927, and then the first drop fell in 1938, and so on, and the ninth drop fell in 2014, and so on. So if you look at the time scales that have lapsed between the two drops, you see that the interval has been increasing as you go to longer and longer age of the system. So for example, earlier on it was like 98 months, but if you go to April 1979, it's 104 months, and now in April 2014, it's about 156 months. So basically, the observation of any event takes longer as the system becomes older and older. So what is essentially happening is that the system, as the system is proceeding in this landscape, and if it is going to lower and lower temperatures, then essentially can get locked into one very deep minima, and the ambient thermal fluctuations are not sufficient enough to kick it out, and it takes a rare event to kick that system out of the local minima and go to the next minima, and so on. So it also gives us some information about how rugged the local landscape is in this high n-dimensional space. So we try to illustrate this through computer experiments. So basically, what I show here is that the idea of equilibrium is essentially that observables, any observable that you have, are independent of when you measure. So if I measure something at time origin 1 or time origin 2 or time origin 3, it really does not matter which time origin I choose. So what we plot here are essentially displacements of particles between time origin 1 plus delta t. And what you see that independent of the time origin, statistically, the maps look all same. So there is no difference, and that is what you expect in equilibrium, that any observable would be independent of when you measure this. On the other hand, if you go to a glassy system, and this we have studied in the context of this mixture of disks in a rough potential, and if I quench across this rough potential, what happens is that if I go to increasing age, the displacement maps are changing very much. Or in other words, the observable depends upon when you make the measurement. Okay, so if I go to older and older system, the amount of displacement that is happening, which is given by the size of the arrows, is much less than what was happening at the earlier age. And this is essentially, again, because if we go back to this landscape, that we are proceeding to lower and lower energy minimum, and we're getting stuck, and the ambient temperature is not sufficient enough to kick me out of that minimum, or there is a rare event that would happen at some point of time, and this would give to the small displacements, and so on and so forth. The aging is a characteristic property of all glass forming systems, and this is something that is taken advantage of in many applications. So I've sort of told you how one can construct a glass, how we get a glass, or why do we create a glass. So basically, in the context of this high-dimensional energy landscape, and certain non-equilibrium properties like these aging properties of a glass. So what I'll do next is I'll perturb the glass, and then we will look at how the glass responds, or this glassy system responds to either thermal or mechanical perturbation. So if I do a thermal perturbation, so what we do is essentially what we apply a thermal gradient in this glass. So I have so if you look at the right-hand corner top, you have a zone which is hot, followed by a zone which is cold, and then again a zone which is hot. And this sets up a temperature gradient inside the system. So you have a temperature profile which is given by this plot, which is just below the schematic diagram, that you have a region which has a high temperature, then you have a region which has low temperature, and then again there is a region which has high temperature, and so on. So because of this thermal gradient, so there will be a thermal current that will be set up across the system. And so heat will be flowing from the hot side to the cold side, and so on. So what is interesting is that in mixtures, if I have a mixture of large particles, small particles, and there's something called a Sorey effect, which essentially is a phenomena that if I have a thermal gradient in a mixture, then a concentration gradient also develops. Or in other words, you will have preferential concentration of large particles in one zone and cold particles in, small particles in another zone. And this we illustrate on the left-hand corner over here. So basically what you can see that if I look at the concentration of the A species and the B species, so A species are more concentrated at the hot zone, whereas the B species are more concentrated at the cold zone. And if I decrease the ambient temperature of the system, we see that these concentration profiles are becoming sharper and sharper, and near the glass transition, essentially you have a huge concentration of B species near the cold zone and larger concentration of A species in the hot zone. So this is a process, this is a physical process that is happening. Now the question is, can you take advantage of this physical process in one way? So what you can do is that you can do this kind of experiments, and this is actually done in various applications. So you can apply, you have a glass which is at a certain temperature, and then you apply a certain pulse of thermal gradient. So depending upon the time over which you have imposed this thermal gradient, so the current will start flowing through the system, and so these A particles and the B particles will also start moving towards these preferential zones, either towards the hot end or the cold end. And this is so basically on the right hand corner, bottom corner, we have a plot. So if I just switch to the because I think without the cursor it's becoming difficult to show. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So if I so here it's when the ambient temperature is below the glass transition temperature. So here I have a concentration profile which is flat, and as I switch on the thermal gradient, the concentration profile start changing because there is a region which is getting melted because of the high temperature, and this melting front starts propagating into the system. So now if I switch off my thermal gradient, then again I have a flat temperature profile, and if I'm at a temperature below the glass transition temperature, then essentially all my dynamics is stopped and it is an arrested state. So in this way I can generate concentration profiles inside the system, and depending upon the requirement, I can tune my thermal gradient such that I have the preferred thermal concentration profiles and so on. So this way I can alter the composition of the material across the spatial scale by applying this kind of thermal gradients. And this is something that is actually observed. I mean, naturally one sees these kind of things happening in volcanoes, where you have volcanic rocks which have different kind of composition of elements across its surface and so on. And also in certain kind of laser ablation experiments where you shine laser and make a hole inside a glass, you will see that around the hole that has formed, this kind of concentration gradients start emerging and so on. Okay, so this was my one slide on thermal gradients. So now I'll talk briefly about mechanical gradients, so mechanical response. So Arijit, how much time do I have?
Pinaki, 2 to 3 minutes.
Oops, okay. Yeah, I'll briefly, maybe I'll take 5 minutes.
Sure, sure.
Okay. So a standard, so if I now take this glass forming system and apply some mechanical stress on the system, for example, what I can do, I can take this glass, which is, let's say, a box of cubic box or something like that, and then I apply shear. So essentially I'm deforming the system. So the standard response of this glass forming system is that you have an initial elastic response, and then there is a stress overshoot, and then there is a stress drop, and eventually there is steady flow. So this is the typical response of a glass forming system. And so this is the stress that is developing in the system as a function of the amount of deformation that the system has undergone. And you can apply different rates of deformation, and you can plot the shear stress that is developing inside the system. And what is characteristic to these glass forming systems is that you need a certain stress threshold for the system to flow. So imagine you have the tomato ketchup or toothpaste. You need to apply a certain force for either the ketchup to flow or the toothpaste to flow out. So that is the yield threshold for this system. Okay. So what we have done is essentially what we looked at is now if I have a glass forming system where I apply some pinning pinned sites and essentially inclusions into this glassy material, then how does the system respond? So these are like inclusions or impurities that you impose inside this inside a glass forming mixture, and you apply then the mechanical shear. And what one observes is that is the following. So this is the standard schematic picture that one has in mind, that if I'm applying this shear, initially there is some elastic deformation, and then beyond a certain threshold, some plastic event happens. So there is some local reorganization of this system, and then the stress is redistributed across the matter and other events kicking and so on. So if I don't have these inclusions inside the system, what is observed are what are known as avalanches, where you have large-scale displacement fields that are emerging. On the other hand, if I include this, have this kind of inclusions or the spinning sites, which are some kind of constraints on the motion, these avalanches are killed. So the consequence of this is that it has a larger strain threshold. It also has a larger yield threshold, and it also has a very different kind of spatial morphology in which the if eventual failure happens inside the system. For example, if I take a pristine glass, you have this kind of very spatially heterogeneous response that is what are known as shear bands. But if I impose this kind of spatial constraints in the form of pin sites, this kind of heterogeneous response is completely destroyed, and you have much more homogeneous response that the system evolves in a spatially homogeneous matter before it starts flowing and so on. So just I'll finish off with some interesting things that have been happening in the context of biomatter and glossy flows. So I think here I have to play this thing. So on the left-hand side is a Drosophila wing that is evolving. And you can see that in the high-resolution camera how this wing structure is forming, and there's a lot of motion of the cells that are happening inside the system. On the right-hand side is foam that is being compressed in the lab, and if you look closely at the two movies, you don't see much difference between the dynamics that is happening at a local scale. So, or in other words, the cellular motion that is happening during the wing formation, or in many cases, in many biological systems, this has features which are very similar to what happens in plasticity of many amorphous systems or glassy systems. So there's a lot of interest in using our knowledge of mechanical response of glassy matter to these biological systems and so on. So one way to model this kind of active matter is to have an aggregate of interacting objects which are persistent or which have persistent motion. So for example, on the left hand side, there is a schematic plot that I've taken from somewhere. So it shows that this cell, it has this kind of straight line motion, which is a persistent motion over a certain time. Then it deviates in, again follows a straight line motion, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine that it has this intrinsic time scale over which this persistence happens. And there's also a self-propulsion force that is happening for this object. And this self-propulsion force comes from some internal chemical process, for example. So on the schematic diagram that I have on the left, So the schematic diagram that I have on the left at the bottom here, I have these spherical objects which have a force acting on each of this spherical object, which is indicated by the arrow. And these objects are running around in space, and each of them has a certain persistence time, which is given by this tau p. And so in this plane, which is formed by this self-propulsion force and this persistence time, one gets a very fascinating and exotic phase diagram. And I'll show you a couple of movies related to that. So again, I have to play. So if I'm in some regime which is somewhere around here, I see this kind of very swirly motions that are happening whenever some local event that is happening. So this kind of bursts of swirly structures emerge. And this kind of swirly motion is actually observed in real active cells, for example, epithelial cells. And that's why this has also given rise to using glassy ideas into this biological systems and so on. And on the other hand, if I go to smaller and smaller active forcing, there one sees very intermittent bursts, like some kind of plastic events that are happening. So if I tune this active forcing, I can go from regions which is a liquid-like behavior to a region which has this the swirly motion, and another region which has this kind of very intermittent dynamics and so on. So there's a huge and rich phase diagram that one can explore, and this is work in progress. And I think we will learn much more about, hopefully, about aggregates of these self-propagating objects and using ideas from glass forming systems and so on. So I'll conclude. So essentially what I've tried to tell you is that how one can construct glassy systems by mixing objects, by applying a complex environment, and then how what are the different kind of mechanical properties that one observes by playing around either with the constituent elements or by some complex self-propulsion and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Pinaki, for this wonderful talk. Questions?
Pinaki, I have a question. Nice talk.
Yes. Yes.
Two questions. One is, you have been talking about glasses in lab scale. Now, what about geophysics? For example, plate tectonics and things move against each other, and Himalayan mountains come out over millions of years. So, are there some glass physics?
Yeah. So actually, 3 years back, there was a meeting in Europe where, which I had also attended. So where there was a meeting place of people working in geophysics and people working on lab glasses. So essentially, the idea was, how do we take ideas from glassy systems into the geophysical context? So for example, as you rightly pointed out, this motion of plates, tectonic plates across each other, or even landslides, or even motion of icebergs, or this kind of different kinds of geophysical phenomena. This one can model in terms of this amorphous structures of different scales, and one can start trying to bridge the scales, so to speak, from microscopic phenomena that we are more accustomed to geophysical phenomena that geophysicists are studying.
Another short question is, there is a lot of excitement about quantum glasses and many-body localization.
Yes.
Glassiness. Can you make a brief comment about it?
Well, I'm not an expert on this at all. No, Bhaskaran, I'll not.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you.
Naki, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Avani here. Hey.
Yes.
Continuing on what Professor Bhaskaran has asked, so in trying to bridge these things, are the interactions must be very different, no? I mean, at nanoscale, the interactions between the constituent particles in a glass, or the interactions between, at this geological scale. Is there any expectation that they are somewhat comparable? Or I would have thought naively they would be very, very different.
No, yes, so exactly. So one has to come up with coarse-grained models. So that is the challenge, how one goes up from microscopic modeling to this kind of macroscopic modeling. Right. And so what you can do is you can write down some phenomenological equations at the moment, some frictional term and so on. And I mean, if you're thinking about some large-scale phenomena, but how does that frictional term comes about from the microscopics, it's not at all understood. So yeah, so this is basically the scheme of things, that if you know the microscopic processes, then you coarse grain and go to the next length scale, and again then you coarse grain to go to higher length scales and so on and so forth. So this is an ambitious project.
Yeah, just to add, I think even friction, my understanding is that friction at a macroscopic and microscope is completely different. There's absolutely, you can't just extend the nanoscopic definitions to, so it's, I think, yeah, it's seems quite difficult task. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, for example, in the meeting that I attended, so there, people working in this kind of faults, I mean, geological faults. So they study the motion of one fault across another, and they are actually doing measurements somewhere in California, for example. So when they're modeling the motion of one fault across another fault, so they, in the equation of motion, they have a certain friction term. And there is no way, I mean, some memory dependent friction and so on. And there is no way that you can think at this moment about how this can be built up from the nanoscale friction. So one really has to figure out the paths from how the nanoscale friction can lead to this kind of macro scale friction. So yeah, it's task, a lot of work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Questions?
Mainly classical, or you also have to take into the quantum effects? Because when you take into the quantum effects, then again the sign problem, compute time problem. So how do you deal with that?
So all that I've talked about are classical problems. No, there is no quantum in whatever I have discussed. And so as far as liquids are concerned, I mean, this is, I mean, okay, so we are talking about different scales. So if I talk about atomic liquids, that is somewhere maybe one can, thinking in terms of interactions, one can think about quantum properties and so on. But if I'm looking at granular matter, or for example, foams or emulsions, there I don't need to really worry about quantum fluctuations, because these are macroscopic objects where even thermal fluctuations are irrelevant. So if I go into the atomic domain, then for all practical purposes, the interaction potentials, the model interaction potentials that we choose are good enough models to actually reproduce the phenomenology. But if you actually want to, let's say, model metallic glass, which is, let's say, a copper zirconium glass, in order to have the copper zirconium interaction, you actually need to do the ab initio calculations and figure out the interaction potential. So that would be the task to do in that case. Yeah, so then in that case, you have to think about the quantum part and so on. Does that answer your question, Sharath?
Because the sign problem.
Sorry, Shantan, I am not getting your question.
Then again, the sign problem becomes.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I'm not really an expert on ab initio. Maybe Vanu can say, I don't know.
No, I think in ab initio also they don't worry so much about sign problem, as in you don't have these empirical interaction potentials, but you basically have a very small systems where you do either energy minimization by solving the Schrodinger equation, or if more ambitious, you try to solve a time dependent Schrodinger equation. So the instead of solving Newton's equations of motion, you then solve the time dependent Schrodinger equation. So basically this is still asking the question, if I have a bunch of systems like 100 atoms with all their electrons and nuclei, what is the energy minimized structures, and can I evolve them?
Okay.
So the quantum modeling is done more in that sense.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Pinaki.
I have one question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So you had shown a slide on Drosophila wing and a foam being compressed. So I was just curious as to what is the external force, the corresponding quantity in the Drosophila wing, which is.
There is no, yeah, so okay, so since I went too fast, so in any biological matter, so it's essentially internal forces, right? So there is no external force. So internal forces are happening because whatever biochemical processes are happening at the local scale, right? So that is why in the next slide, when we are modeling this kind of biological matter or this kind of active matter, we are having this additional term, which is this self-propulsion force. So this self-propulsion force is not present in the classic, I mean, in the non-active matter, the passive system. So if I'm modeling active fluids, atomic fluids and so on, I just have interparticle interactions. There is no additional self-propulsion force. The self-propulsion force is only chosen in the context of active matter, where I'm associating this force with whatever internal processes that are happening inside a cell, for example. Okay.
Right. Okay.
So so these are very two different cases. So in one case you have internal forces which are resulting in this kind of local shear. On the other hand, on the right hand side you have a foam which is being compressed, and there you have the internal, whatever dynamics it is happening inside the foam. So, but if I look at the very local scale, there are what are known as T1 events. So essentially you have neighbors which are changing. Basically imagine you have 4 neighbors and they are just reorganizing among themselves. So similar kind of T1 events are happening in the Drosophila wings as well as in the foam. And that's where the similarity lies. So of course, there are other issues that you have birth of new cells and so on and so forth, which is not there in the foam. Yeah, so these are additional complications, but on the first hand, if I look at this growing colony of cells, it has very big similarities with what we know from macroscopic shear of this amorphous matter.
Okay, thanks.
Questions?
I have a short question to Pinaki and Vani.
Yes.
Now, I'm told that hydrogen bonded systems like water, simple water, the glassiness has some unavoidable quantum effects. Like if you take super cooled water and make it a ice glass, then these hydrogen bond networks and quantum tunneling and so on seem to play some role. Can you comment on that?
Bhaskaran, I really don't know. So,
Professor Bhaskaran, the only very short answer to that is the way the modeling is done today. In fact, classical very coarse models reproduce water properties much better than quantum models. Quantum models tend to actually make water freeze. That has been a very long-standing problem. It's very difficult to incorporate these things, and actually, surprisingly, the classical models seem to largely, for many practical purposes, outperform the quantum models today. That's the.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Questions? If not, let's thank Pinaki for this wonderful talk. Thank you, Pinaki.
Okay. Thank you.
So let's all meet on then 15th for the next edition. So see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.